How much would you trade your country's freedom for? $4.8 billion. A handshake under a chandelier. A signature on paper written by someone else. That afternoon in Ouagadougou, the hall gleamed with diplomatic theater. Cameras clicked. Ministers smiled. Foreign guests nodded as if a continent's history was about to be rewritten again. But under that elegant chaos, one man's hand trembled. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Dressed not in his military fatigues, but a simple African-printed suit. Surrounded by pressure foreign and domestic, yet his eyes were locked on one line, one page, one clause, buried on page 178. They called it investment, they called it mutual prosperity, but in the shadows of that contract, they wrote another word: occupation. It wasn't signed in blood, it was coded in footnotes, hidden in the language of friendship. A foreign army granted power over a sovereign land not by war, but by pen. That's not partnership. That's colonization modernized. But Traoré didn't sign. He stood. He rose not just for himself, but for a continent weary of applause at its own auction. He spoke. And that's where this story begins. Subscribe not just for the video, but for a dream called New Africa. It didn't begin with a clause. It began with a word. 3 weeks before the signing ceremony, Ibrahim Traoré had invited Wei Jiang, CEO of the Chinese Prosperity Mining Consortium, to the presidential palace for a quiet dinner. Traditional Burkina dishes were served. Jollof rice with roasted guinea fowl, dried okra stew, kunu for dessert, smiles exchanged, pledges repeated, nothing out of place until a single sentence. Your lithium reserves, Wei said, raising his glass, are among the purest in the world. With proper management, they could last for generations. It was meant as a compliment, a gesture of reassurance. But it wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Generations spoken with a deliberate pause, a quiet certainty. Not 25 years, not 30. Generations. That night, Traoré couldn't sleep. He replayed the conversation. He questioned the nuance. He turned to the only person in his team who understood Mandarin deeply, not just linguistically but culturally, Issa Konaté. Barely in his 30s, Konaté had studied in Beijing, one of only a handful of Burkinabe fluent in both official and informal Mandarin. Quiet, precise, deeply loyal. Traoré had insisted he be present at every negotiation, not just as translator but as a silent observer. What exactly did he mean? Traoré asked him that evening. Konaté hesitated, then spoke. Sir, in Mandarin, Mr. Wei used the term shi, dai. It doesn't mean long-term, it means forever, as in perpetual control, eternal stewardship. That word stuck like thorns. From that moment, everything changed. Traoré ordered a re-review of every clause, every draft, every footnote, and more importantly, every mismatch between the Mandarin and French versions of the contract. He instructed Konaté to monitor all informal exchanges between the Chinese delegation, especially what wasn't being translated aloud. At the next negotiation, the facade continued. Smiles, gifts, carefully worded promises. On paper, the contract looked pristine. Infrastructure investment technology transfers, local hiring guarantees, and a seemingly generous 60-40 profit split in Burkina Faso's favor. Too generous. But as each revised draft came through, Traoré noticed a pattern. Earlier concerns were fixed, yet each version introduced new obscure phrases, ambiguous definitions, legal loops, soft threats disguised as standard protections. There was one phrase that kept recurring: Appendix F, security parameters. It was referenced 4 times, never quoted, always deferred. At a glance, it looked routine. Protection of foreign investment, maintenance of public order, rapid response protocols. But there was something about how it was buried like a footnote within a footnote that made Traoré uneasy. He asked his legal team, "Have you read this appendix in full?" They nodded. "Standard legalese, Mr. President." "Read it again," he replied, "but this time with your hands not tied by expectation." They did, but they missed it. So Traoré decided he would read it himself. He flipped to page 178. He read it once, twice. On the 3rd time his fingers trembled, not from confusion, But from clarity, the cameras were ready. The room glowed with anticipation. International journalists whispered into microphones. Ministers adjusted their jackets, and Wei Jiang began his speech. "We stand today," he declared, "on the threshold of a new era of prosperity, of brotherhood, of trust between the great nations of China and Burkina Faso." But Traoré wasn't listening. He was reading. Page 178, Appendix F. And in that quiet chaos, the words screamed at him. A 50-kilometer security radius around every mining site. Chinese security forces granted extraterritorial jurisdiction, power to neutralize threats without the consent or even knowledge of Burkina authorities. Emergency clauses that allowed indefinite extensions. Sovereign land turned into invisible zones of foreign control. He closed the document slowly, then stood up. The room hushed. "Mr. President," whispered Economy. "Minister Kabore, they're waiting for your statement." Traoré nodded, then walked to the podium. He smiled politely. "This is indeed a historic day," he began, voice calm as iron. "But before we sign, I'd like to share a few thoughts." Wei's smile held. Traoré held up the contract. "I find it curious," he said, "that the Mandarin version of our agreement contains elaborations not present in the French one." A pause. Cameras clicked. Kabore's brow furrowed. Wei leaned forward. "Perhaps," Traoré continued, "Mr. Wei can explain why Appendix F grants Chinese security forces authority over sovereign Burkina territory." The room froze. "And perhaps," he added, "someone can clarify why emergency clauses, undefined and unbounded, would allow this contract to renew itself indefinitely." Whispers exploded. Wei's translator scrambled to speak. Wei's face stiffened. "There must be a misunderstanding," he said smoothly. "Translation errors, perhaps. Minor technical details." Traoré didn't blink. "Minor," he echoed, his tone still soft. "I would not call foreign troops controlling my cities a technicality." Now Wei dropped the mask. "Mr. President," he said coldly, "your country needs this investment. Your lithium is worthless without the technology to extract it. Perhaps you're overreacting to standard protective clauses." Traoré studied him. "Standard," he repeated, yet hidden. Buried in appendices, mistranslated in versions, deliberately veiled. He placed the contract on the table, closed. "What I see here isn't a partnership. It's a colonization attempt legalized." Gasps. Kabore reached for a handkerchief. Finance Minister Urago stared at the table. The Chinese delegation stiffened. Journalists rushed to file headlines, but Traoré was already walking away. He glanced at Konaté. A silent nod. A war had begun without a bullet fired. If you discovered such a clause in your nation's contract, would you sign or would you stand? The room descended into chaos. Journalists shouted. Ministers exchanged panicked glances. The Chinese delegation huddled, murmuring into earpieces. But Ibrahim Traoré, he turned, walked out, silent, steady. Behind him, only one man followed without hesitation, Issa Konaté. They entered a side chamber, shut the heavy wooden door. "Tell me everything," Traoré said. Konaté's voice trembled not from fear, but from the weight of truth. "Sir, I've been gathering evidence. I recorded their private conversations. They called it strategic expansion through contractual means. The clauses were no accident. They were calculated." He reached into his jacket, produced a small recorder. "They never planned to hire locals," he continued. "They intend to bring thousands of Chinese workers. And they bribed our ministers." Traoré's jaw clenched. "Which ministers?" A pause. "Economy Minister Kabore, Finance Minister Urago." Silence. Cold, crushing, heavy. Traoré didn't shout. He simply nodded. Then turned to his security chief, who had just entered, face pale. "Sir, the man said the Chinese are threatening to withdraw all investments. Kabore is urging you to reconsider. He says the economy will collapse." "I imagine he is," Traoré replied. "Then quietly place Ministers Kabore and Urago under house arrest, prepare emergency session, cabinet 1 hour, and broadcast it live." "Live, sir." "Yes, the people deserve to know." That evening the nation watched. No flags, no scripted speeches, just a man in a chair holding a recorder in one hand and the Constitution in the other. "I rejected a $4.8 billion deal today," he began. "Not because we don't need investment, but because the cost was our freedom. He played the recordings. The nation listened. To betrayal, to greed, to collusion. Then he spoke again. Our minerals don't just belong to us. They belong to every generation that will walk this land after we are gone. I will not sign them away, not to China, not to any empire. Cabinet ministers sat in stunned silence. Then Traoré turned to the defense minister. I understand you were discussing permanent military bases with Chinese attachés. The man stuttered. They told me you approved it, that it was part of the package. Who told you that? The minister's eyes dropped to the two empty chairs, Kabore and Urago. Traoré nodded grimly. The corruption, he said, runs deeper than I thought. He stood. This is the line. This is the moment. Burkina Faso will not swap Western colonizers for Eastern ones. We will dig slower, build slower, but we will build free. No applause. Just stillness. Just truth. They offered us jobs on the land that was once ours and called it progress. The dust did not settle easily. Within days, China froze all infrastructure projects in Burkina Faso. Agricultural subsidies disappeared. Construction halted. Power outages returned. Foreign media declared a looming collapse. But inside the country, something else was rising. Pride. From Ouagadougou to Bobo Dioulasso, people gathered in streets, not in protest, but in solidarity. We are not for sale echoed in chants. Children waved handmade flags. Elderly citizens cried, remembering previous generations who had signed away their land in silence. For the first time in decades, the silence had been broken. Traoré didn't wait. He convened regional leaders, shared the unredacted contract. Ghana, Tanzania, DRC each requested to compare it with their own deals. Shock spread across the continent. Hidden clauses, emergency renewal traps, security loopholes. It was a pattern, a strategy, a continent-wide strategy of subtle recolonization through ink, not tanks. But Traoré did more than resist. He built. He reached out not to Washington nor Beijing, but La Paz, Buenos Aires, New Delhi. In a surprising move, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, the Lithium Triangle offered technical assistance. They didn't send demands. They sent engineers. They didn't propose ownership. They offered training. Together with smaller African investors and partners from India, Burkina Faso launched its own lithium development program. Slowly, painfully, but freely. 3 months after the failed signing ceremony, Traoré stood at the edge of a construction site. Bulldozers hummed, machinery gleamed. On each was a bold print made in Burkina Faso. The new finance minister stood beside him. It will take longer this way, she said. But every job here is Burkinabe. Every franc stays in our economy. Traoré smiled, watching young workers in overalls, some fresh graduates from domestic engineering schools, operate machines they had built themselves. Elsewhere, communities adapted. Food cooperatives blossomed. Farmers worked together to offset supply shocks. Universities launched open tech initiatives, crowdsourcing energy solutions. Opposition parties tried to weaponize hardship, accusing Traoré of ideological arrogance. But the people did not listen, because for the first time they had been told the truth. One morning an aide rushed into his office. Sir President Ningwo of Congo-Brazzaville is on the line. He's facing a similar clause in a Chinese oil deal. He asks for your advice. Traoré picked up the phone. They spoke for over an hour. Clause by clause, word by word, history by history. At the end, Ningwo asked quietly, "How did you find the strength to walk away from so much, when your country needs it so badly?" Traoré looked at the paperweight on his desk, a small wooden carving of his father's hoe, a reminder of the land they had once lost. He answered slowly, "My father once said they offered us jobs on the land that was once ours and called it development. But true progress means owning your future, not just working for someone else's." That week, Burkina Faso announced the formation of the Pan-African Resource Sovereignty Coalition, a pact between African nations to review, renegotiate, or reject exploitative foreign resource agreements. Across Africa, a phrase began to circulate online: no contract without sunlight. Burkina Faso owns the 4th largest gold reserve in Africa, but ranks among the 10 poorest countries. 6 months later, the sun rose over Ouagadougou. But this time it did not rise alone. Presidents, engineers, ministers, and youth leaders from across the continent had gathered, invited by a country once written off as too small, too poor, too dependent. Burkina Faso was hosting the first Pan-African Resource Sovereignty Summit. In a hall once meant for signing foreign contracts, African nations signed something far more powerful, a declaration of interdependence, built not on desperation but on dignity. Ibrahim Traoré stood at the podium. He didn't speak of GDP. He spoke of legacy. He didn't mention lithium prices. He spoke of children's futures. Our resources, he said, are not just economic assets. They are historical testimonies, proof that we were never poor, only pillaged. Behind him, a screen displayed a simple phrase, painted by school children across the country. Better to dig slow in freedom than fast in chains. Construction on Burkina Faso's first domestically operated lithium processing facility had just begun. Young engineers trained locally, mentored regionally, were building it piece by piece. No shortcuts, no signatures in the dark. What had started as a refusal became a ripple. What had once been a clause became a cause. Across Africa, nations paused, looked again at what they'd signed. Ghana renegotiated its cobalt exports. Congo suspended a Chinese oil deal. Tanzania demanded full disclosure from mining contractors. No one saw it coming, because revolutions no longer needed guns. They needed readers, translators, teachers, and leaders who knew the weight of silence. As Traoré stepped down from the stage, an old proverb came to mind, one that Wei Jiang had once quoted during the negotiations. If you want to be rich for a year, grow grain. For 10 years, grow trees. But if you want to be rich for a lifetime, grow people. Wei had used it to justify exploitation, but Traoré now understood its real meaning. To grow people is to trust them with the truth. To grow a continent is to own its story, its land, its terms. Not rented, not borrowed, but rooted. So as we close this story, we ask not just what was avoided, but what was begun. A chapter of sovereignty. A page without fine print. A contract signed not in fear, but in freedom. If you believe in a self-sufficient Africa, if you believe we can build slow but free, then comment below New Africa. They said we were poor. But what they never said, what they never dared to say, was that we were made poor. Burkina Faso's story is not just a national episode. It's an echo, a reminder, a warning, and above all, a beginning. Because for far too long, Africa's contracts have been written in boardrooms we never entered, translated in languages we barely spoke, and signed with the ink of desperation, not dignity. But this time, one man read the fine print and chose to read it aloud. And in doing so, he did more than tear up a deal. He lit a match in a room soaked with silence. From Ouagadougou to Kinshasa, from Dar es Salaam to Accra, what began as a solitary act of defiance rippled across borders. And it wasn't just the contracts we began to scrutinize, it was the narrative. The idea that we, the people of this continent, must always trade control for convenience, sovereignty, for stability, dignity, for development. That lie no longer holds, because this time we saw the contract before it saw us. And now we ask the uncomfortable questions. Why is it that the richest lands birth the poorest people? Why do the nations with gold, cobalt, oil, and lithium often struggle to feed their children? Why must every road come with a rope? Every school with a surveillance clause? Every investment with invisible ink? These questions have been asked before, often in whispers in exile and prison. But now they are asked openly. And not just by presidents, but by farmers, by students, by traders in markets, and mothers in villages. Because something in the air has shifted. It is not anger, it is not arrogance, it is awareness. And awareness is the beginning of resistance. We are told that without foreign aid, we will collapse. That without external oversight, we will descend into chaos. That without the contracts of the global north, or the checkbooks of the global east, we have no future. But Ibrahim Traoré showed us a different calculation, that freedom has its own economy, that pride has its own profit, that even when they withdraw their billions, they cannot bankrupt our spirit. They cannot foreclose a people who have begun to wake up. And that's the danger, isn't it? Not the loss of a deal, but the loss of control. Because if one African nation can walk away from exploitation, others might follow. If one leader can refuse the pen, others might tear up their own clauses. And if one people can unite not for an election, not for a party, but for a principle, then the very blueprint of recolonization begins to crack. That is what this story has sparked. Not just headlines, but a hunger. Not just policy, but poetry. Not just policy reform, but people reform. And it is the people who now carry the torch. Because while governments debate, communities build. While economists panic, engineers experiment. While diplomats stall, young Africans plant their feet and say, "We are not your project. We are our own promise." This isn't nationalism. It's repair. This isn't isolationism. It's liberation. To those who still see us as chessboards for their pipelines, pawns for their profit margins, we say this: Africa is not up for sale. Not at the price of silence. Not at the cost of sovereignty. Not anymore. And to our own leaders, the message is just as clear: read the contracts. All of them. Translate them. Debate them in public. Publish them in newspapers. Because if you hide the terms, you hide from your people. And if you hide from your people, you no longer lead them, you betray them. Traoré may have been one man, but he was not alone. He stood because a generation stands behind him. A generation tired of being told that change must be imported. That hope must be outsourced. That freedom must be deferred. No more. Now, when a child in Burkina Faso hears the phrase strategic partnership, they don't just think of foreign flags and borrowed dreams, they think of sovereignty. They think of solar panels built in Feta engineers, trained in Kudugu contracts, debated on radio live for all to hear. They think of truth, and that is more powerful than any clause. Because truth travels, and when truth becomes habit, colonization, no matter how cleverly disguised, loses its grip. So let the world take note. Let them watch our roads being built slower but stronger. Let them see our schools fill with students, not slogans. Let them witness a continent not begging for aid, but offering vision. Because we are not just resisting exploitation, we are rewriting the terms, with our own pens, in our own language, on our own land. And that contract needs no fine print, because it is signed in public. It is signed in pride. It is signed in pain, but also in possibility. So when they ask, what does Africa want? We answer, not sympathy, not charity, just honesty, just respect, just a fair seat at the table, or better yet, a table of our own. Built not on borrowed bricks, but on the bedrock of those who came before. Traoré's decision may have cost billions, but it bought something more valuable. A future not subcontracted, a legacy not rented, a nation not managed but led. And that is worth more than lithium. That is worth more than gold. That is the new Africa. We came to watch a video, but we left carrying a mirror, because this story wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was about us, all of us, those who have stood silently while deals were made in our name, those who have scrolled past headlines about contracts we didn't write in languages we don't speak, with consequences we will be forced to live. And that is the first lesson: silence is complicity. For too long, we have allowed the business of our futures to happen behind closed doors. We've trusted that those in power will protect what is ours. But power unchecked, unscrutinized, tends not toward protection but profit. And the cost, it's always paid in land, in labor, in lost generations. When Ibrahim Traoré stood up, he wasn't just standing for Burkina Faso. He was standing for anyone who has ever felt the weight of a decision they didn't make. He was standing for every village whose soil has been taken without consent. For every worker promised a job but handed a chain. For every citizen who watched their leaders speak of growth while their lives grew harder. And in that moment, he taught us something that schools rarely do. That true leadership is not about pleasing investors. It's about protecting inheritance. And inheritance isn't just property. It's principle. It's the right to say this is ours. Not because we have weapons, but because we have worth. The second lesson, read the fine print. Not just on paper, but in life, in language, in policy, in silence. Because hidden power always hides in the small text. In the clauses that sound too complex. In the footnotes that nobody reads. In the translation that isn't quite right. The truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. But it's still there if we listen. And Traoré listened. Not with suspicion, but with clarity. Not with paranoia, but with responsibility. He didn't assume bad faith, he proved it. And that proof is what changed everything. Because once you know what's hidden, you can no longer act like you didn't see. The third lesson, courage is contagious. When one person refuses to kneel, it reminds the rest of us that standing is possible. Traoré's defiance wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't televised with fireworks and flags. It was quiet, measured, determined. The kind of strength that doesn't ask for applause, only truth. And we learn that bravery isn't the absence of fear, it's what you do in spite of it. He knew the cost. He knew what would happen when he said no. The power outages, the threats, the international backlash, but he also knew something else. That there's a worse price than poverty. It's slavery wrapped in investment. So yes, the economy suffered. Yes, projects stopped. But something else started. Self-respect. And that's the fourth lesson. That dignity cannot be imported. It is grown. In hardship, in humility, in hunger, but also in honesty. And that honesty has spread. Across WhatsApp groups, over dinner tables, through schools and street corners. We are beginning to talk about what we sign, about who we let in, about how we define development. And maybe for the first time in decades we're asking, what do we want for ourselves? Not what they offer, not what they promise, but what we decide we deserve. Because the final lesson, the most powerful one, is this. Freedom doesn't come when the chains fall off. It comes when we stop accepting them as normal, when we stop measuring success by how much aid we receive, when we stop calling recolonization growth, when we stop thinking of ourselves as too poor to say no. This story has changed us. It has given us vocabulary. It has given us vision. And above all, it has given us voice. So now we must ask, what are the contracts we've signed in our own lives? What have we traded for comfort? What have we accepted because we feared collapse? Are we still waiting for someone else to give us permission to resist, to change, to begin? Traoré showed us that we don't have to wait, that the collapse of exploitation can be the rise of reconstruction, that even if we walk alone, we walk further when we walk in truth, that no cause is too small to fight, that no nation is too poor to dream. And as we reflect, as we share this story with others, as we comment New Africa beneath this video, it's not just a hashtag, it's a promise that we will read the next contract, that we will question the next speech, that we will listen more deeply, speak more boldly, build more patiently, and dream more fearlessly, because this is our future. Not theirs to sell, not theirs to lease, but ours to write. One clause at a time, one generation at a time, one truth at a time. So the next time someone says Africa needs saving, tell them this. Africa is not a victim. Africa is not a market. Africa is not a minefield of opportunity for others to exploit. Africa is a voice, a people, a power, a page that is no longer blank. And now that we've begun to write, no one else gets to hold the pen. We often think revolutions begin with marches, with chants, with fists raised under smoke-filled skies. But sometimes they begin with a question. Did you read it? That was the question that changed Burkina Faso's course. And now it's the question echoing across the continent. From students to senators, from taxi drivers to tech entrepreneurs, the conversation has shifted. No longer about foreign aid or 5-year plans, but about ownership, accountability, and truth. Because if a president can question $1 billion contract, what stops a citizen from questioning a policy alone, a law? We've learned that the tools of control have changed. They don't always come in tanks. They come in tenders, in infrastructure loans that turn into land grabs, in partnerships that silence parliaments, in scholarships that groom future gatekeepers of exploitation. But we see it now, and once seen it cannot be unseen. That's the power of a moment like Traoré's refusal. It doesn't just expose injustice, it reveals possibility. Because for too long, Africa's potential has been narrated by others. They told us what we're worth. They told us where to drill, what to plant, whom to borrow from. And we listened not because we were weak, but because we were exhausted. Because survival felt urgent. Because the scars of colonialism left us afraid to say no. But this time we said it. No, not to aid, not to development, but to dependency dressed as diplomacy, to exploitation dressed as expertise, to colonization dressed as contracts. And in that no, we heard something rare: self-trust. And that self-trust, that instinct to question, to delay, to dig deeper, is contagious. It doesn't just belong to presidents or ministers. It belongs to us, to the young man in Nairobi who now reads every headline twice, to the woman in Bamako who asks where her country's gold is going, to the diaspora child in London or Paris who sees now that Africa's weakness was never a lack of brains, but a lack of leverage. That's changing, because we are no longer begging for a seat at the global table. We are building our own, brick by brick, clause by clause, with blueprints written in our languages, with agendas shaped by our values, and with futures owned by our children, not least to foreign investors. But here's what we must remember: the work isn't done. Traoré opened a door, but we must walk through it. He refused one contract, we must review thousands. He broadcast one truth, we must amplify it daily. Because those who benefit from our ignorance are regrouping. They will return not with tanks, but with tokens, with scholarships, with development deals that sound greener, cleaner, more inclusive. But the ink won't change until the power behind the pen does. That's our role now, not just to be inspired, but to be informed, to demand transparency, to educate ourselves not just about history, but about policy, to make it unacceptable for any leader to sign in secret, to make it normal for every citizen to understand the terms of foreign engagement. Because sovereignty is not a slogan, it's a system, built through institutions, strengthened by scrutiny, protected by pride. And our pride, it doesn't come from GDP charts. It comes from knowing we chose freedom even when it was harder, that we chose to walk away from a lie even when it cost us comfort, that we chose to define development not by speed but by sustainability. We now understand something critical, that no matter how much lithium we mine, how many roads we build, how many exports we ship, if the deals are rigged, we remain poor. If the terms are hidden, we remain voiceless. If the power is elsewhere, we remain owned. So yes, let the lights go out for a while. Let the roads take longer to build, because better to build with conscience than collapse with convenience. And when they say we've sabotaged our future, we will answer no, we've reclaimed it. Because the most dangerous myth we ever believed was that we needed saving. This story dismantles that myth. And now we must write new myths, of engineers trained at home, of contracts negotiated in daylight, of wealth that stays, circulates, builds. We must learn not just to survive foreign interference, but to outgrow it. To become fluent in the language of law, finance, trade, not just poetry and protest. To prepare our children not just to resist injustice, but to redesign the systems that allow it. Because the world doesn't fear an angry Africa, it fears a prepared one. An Africa that reads every footnote, that challenges every handshake, that demands equality, not charity, that acts, not reacts. And that is what we're becoming, prepared. And so we say again, this time louder, no contract without sunlight, no development without dignity, no investment without integrity. We will no longer be the continent with riches underfoot and chains overhead. We are rising not just in defiance, but in design, not just in spirit, but in structure, not just in protest, but in policy. And this rise, slow, fragile, beautiful, belongs to all of us. Whether you're in Lagos or Lilongwe in Addis or Abidjan in Brussels or Boston, if you believe Africa deserves to own its story, its terms, its tomorrow, then you are part of this. This is not just Traoré's legacy. It is ours. Because this time the revolution is not being televised. It is being localized. In schools, in town halls, in WhatsApp groups, in every place where someone now dares to ask, did you read it? And better yet, did we write it? I have seen many reigns. I have seen flags change, borders drawn, leaders rise and fall like the sun. But this moment we are living in, it feels different. It is not just a season. It is a turning. And I say this as one who remembers when the land was taken the first time. Not with contracts, but with guns. Not with smiles, but with whips. We were told we were primitive. That the gold beneath our rivers, the diamonds beneath our villages, the oil under our soil, belonged to someone who could use it better. And when they finally left, they left us maps. We didn't draw debts we didn't make and deals we didn't understand. So we tried to build, but we built with borrowed bricks. And every time we raised a wall, someone came offering faster cement. They said, take this, sign here, just one clause, it will help your people. And so again we signed, not with joy, but with tired hope. Until one day this boy, this captain stood and said no. I watched it on the television in my small living room in Bobo Dioulasso. My granddaughter sat beside me. She is studying economics now. But that day we learned something her books never taught. She turned to me eyes wide and asked, Grandfather, what does it mean to lose your land with a pen? And I told her, it means they no longer need to shoot you to steal from you. It means colonization has learned to wear a suit, to offer scholarships, to build roads with one hand and remove sovereignty with the other. But that boy, yes, I call him a boy because I am old, he understood. He didn't just read a contract. He remembered the past. And that is what our children must learn. Not just numbers and grammar, but memory. Because memory is resistance. Memory reminds us that we were once owners, not tenants. That we once governed our land, not merely managed it for others. That the hoe my father held had more honesty than the briefcase many ministers now carry. So today I speak not to the presidents, not to the foreign advisors, but to you, the young ones. The ones still deciding what kind of Africa you will inherit. The ones who must now guard what we nearly lost. You must read. Not just textbooks, but treaties. Not just WhatsApp, but white papers. You must ask questions. Hard ones. When they say foreign investment, ask who owns the profit. When they say development project, ask who holds the blueprint. When they say security cooperation, ask whose boots will touch your soil. Because it is your soil, and it remembers. It remembers every drop of blood that fell when we resisted. It remembers every footstep of those who were taken. It remembers the silence of those who knew but signed anyway. Do not repeat their silence. Do not inherit their chains. And do not confuse poverty with failure. We are not poor. We are pillaged. There is a difference. They took our rubber, our cocoa, our copper, our coltan, and called us underdeveloped. But what is development if it begins with theft? What is partnership if it ends in silence? You must redefine these words. You must speak in your own tongue, write in your own hand, build in your own time. And you must learn from each other, not from those who still see Africa as a pit, not a place. Look to your brothers in the South, in Bolivia, in India, in Chile. Learn how they broke free slowly, painfully, but fully. And then teach your children. Because if we do not teach them what was stolen, they will never know what to protect. Let me tell you a proverb from my grandfather. When the forest forgets its fire, the axe returns. Africa must not forget. Not the chains, not the contracts, not the calm betrayal of bad friends. We must teach our memory like we teach mathematics. We must tell stories of betrayal, but also of bravery. We must name the men who sold us, but also the ones who said no. Because the world will not remember Traoré for us. They will try to write him as reckless, as difficult, as a nationalist. But we know he was a guardian, not of pride, of purpose. He reminded us that true power is not in signing quickly, but in reading slowly. And that is what you must do. Slow down. Ask again. Read twice. Refuse once even if it costs. Because dignity, my child, is always expensive. But losing it costs more. I am old. Soon I will join the ancestors. But before I go, I ask you, guard this new beginning. Do not let it become another page in a forgotten book. Turn it into a curriculum, a movement, a culture, where every citizen knows the clauses of every deal, where every child learns the cost of silence, where no leader can sell what does not belong to him. And if they try stand up, stand firm, not in violence, but in truth. Truth is heavier than a gun. Slow